This is the final part of week 4 slides, and we are continuing with a special case of the Giffen good on slide 15. Now, a Giffen good is a good whose demand curve slopes upward because the negative income effect, which we'll see in a moment, is larger than the substitution effect. So this type of good basically violates the basic law of demand as people consume more of it as price rises and vice versa. So this is primarily due to its dominating negative income effect. So it is an inferior good that has no close substitutes, and income and substitution effects are key in explaining how this type of good violates that law of demand. So please note that this type of good is the exceptional case. A Veblen good is another type of example, but in that case, it relates to luxury goods. So rice is an example of a Giffen good, for instance. So now let's turn our attention to figure 4.8. Now, when a good is inferior and the income effect is large enough to dominate the substitution effect, you would see that the demand curve would be upward sloping, and that is essentially what your Giffen good is. So let's just have a look at those effects. We can see that the income effect over here is larger than the substitution effect. So the net total effect is in fact negative. So now this consumer, if we start looking at this curve in detail, this graph, this consumer is initially at point A on utility curve U1. And when the price falls, we know that the budget line will shift outward, and that will become the new budget line. When the price of food falls, it pivots outward. And we will see that the total effect as a result of the price of food falling, given that this case is a Giffen good, it is a movement from point A to point B. And that is vastly different to the other two cases that we previously saw. Now we can again break down these effects into our substitution and income effects. Now the substitution effect, we will see, always moves in the same direction when the price of a good falls. It will move in the direction of that price that has fallen. So this movement from A to D, or from E to F2, that represents your substitution effect. Note that this is still on the same indifference curve U1, so utility or the level of satisfaction remains unchanged. However, D touches this budget constraint. This one is the imaginary budget constraint drawn with the same slope or parallel to your new budget constraint after the price of food has fallen. So if we compare points A to points D, which is your substitution effect, that is given by the changes in the relative prices of the goods. So the relative prices has changed. Food has become relatively cheaper. So because food was relatively cheaper, more food is purchased, and we can see that more food units would be purchased. But the substitution effect, as we can see there, is still smaller than the income effect. So, with the increase in purchasing power that the consumer has gained because of the price of food falling, the consumer now prefers to purchase more clothing. So, more clothing would be purchased instead, and that is reflected by this movement from D to B, or the total income effect is from D to B. We can see it is reflected by F2 to F1, and that is on point D is on the new budget constraint on a higher indifference curve U2. So that is the bundle that the consumer chooses. So although the consumer has less food now than before, given by that decline, the consumer is better off on this higher indifference curve B at this point B because of the preference for more clothing, and that is revealed preference in action. So the consumer ends up at point B on U2 and is better off. So as a result of this, we can make the following conclusion. So because this income effect, as I said, F2, F1, was larger than that substitution effect between E and F2, it's going to lead to a total effect that is negative. So the decrease in the price of food led to a lower quantity of food demanded. That concludes the special case of a given good. Lastly, there is an example 4.2 on the effects of a gasoline tax or petrol tax. So again, just read through this example for knowledge enrichment purposes. And that concludes the work for week 4.